Vancouver, Canada, a city caught between the shimmering lights of progressive acceptance and the deep shadows of prejudice. It was here, in the early 2000s, that Shelby Tracy Tom tried to carve out a life of dignity, identity, and survival. Born in 1971, Shelby had not always been known by that name. Assigned male at birth, she spent her early years in a world that didn't recognize who she truly was. Like many transgender women of her generation, Shelby's youth was marked by confusion, silence, and often rejection. But through the static of social expectations and judgment, her truth grew louder. By the late 1990s, Shelby had transitioned. She embraced her identity with courage, not because it was easy, but because it was the only way she could truly exist. Her transition was not just a medical journey. It was a battle for visibility in a society where transgender women were still widely misunderstood and routinely dehumanized. Friends and advocates would later describe Shelby as intelligent, strong-willed, and kind. She wasn't just surviving, she was trying to thrive. But the path for transgender women, especially those estranged from family support and consistent employment opportunities, was fraught with hard choices. Shelby made one of them. She became a sex worker in Vancouver's Davie Street Village, a known LGBTQ+ district. For her, it was a way to remain independent, to fund her transition, and to reclaim control in a world that so often took it away from her. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was hers. Like many trans sex workers, Shelby operated at the intersection of danger and invisibility. The job came with risk, but she showed up anyway, night after night. On the streets and in the neon-lit corners of the city, she created space for herself where the world had tried to deny her one. In Canada, at the time, transgender rights were still an emerging topic. Legal protections were vague, and societal understanding was minimal. Shelby didn't expect to be treated like a hero, but she demanded to be seen as human. She wasn't just another statistic. She was Shelby, and she was fighting, quietly but powerfully, for a life of her own choosing. But the freedom she fought for would be shattered in a single, violent moment, with a man she had never met before. Vancouver after dark is a city of contradictions. By day, Davie Street Village pulses with color, rainbow crosswalks, inclusive cafes, and a community proud of its resilience. It's one of the most recognizable LGBTQ+ neighborhoods in Canada. For many, it represents sanctuary, a place where identity isn't hidden but celebrated. But when the sun sets and the lights dim, another reality surfaces, one marked by struggle, survival, and silence. In the early 2000s, this pocket of the city was a refuge for many like Shelby Tracy Tom, a place where she could be herself without masking her truth. But even in this hub of supposed safety, the shadows loomed large. Davie Street was a paradox. On one side, it was alive with freedom, the laughter from late-night diners, the drag shows that roared past midnight, the flickering neon signs that said, "You belong here." On the other, it harbored the quiet tragedies of those pushed to the margins, transgender women, many of them sex workers, who had no choice but to negotiate their worth in alleyways and hotel rooms. This was the world Shelby moved through, in plain sight, yet often invisible to the wider society. She rented rooms, walked familiar blocks, and met clients in nearby hotels, each encounter laced with both necessity and risk. Because in a world where trans identities were fetishized and criminalized, every night was a game of trust, and every stranger a possible threat. Police presence in the area was inconsistent. Reports of harassment or abuse often went uninvestigated. Trans sex workers knew better than to rely on a system that had never protected them. Instead, they relied on each other, sharing warnings, watching corners, remembering license plates. Shelby wasn't naive. She understood the dangers, the stares, the whispered threats. But she also knew how to navigate the night. She carried herself with calm control, a quiet strength that masked the exhaustion of always having to be alert. Yet, even the most streetwise among them could not predict the unpredictable. Danger, sometimes, wore a polite face, and predators didn't always look like villains. One night, in May 2003, Shelby met a man named Jatin Patel. Nothing about him stood out. He wasn't loud, he wasn't aggressive. He simply asked for her time. Just another client, it seemed. But what began as just another night on Davy Street would soon become Shelby's last. His name was Jatin Patel, a name that, until May 2003, meant little to anyone outside his circle. He was 29 years old, with no significant criminal record, no prior connection to Shelby Tracy Tom, and no clear history of violence. But in the space of one night, he would become the central figure in a tragedy that would shake Vancouver's LGBTQ+ community to its core. Jatin wasn't from the Davy Street scene. He didn't move in the same world as Shelby, nor did he appear to have any connections to the sex trade. On the surface, he was an ordinary man. Quiet, unassuming, the kind of person who might walk by you on the street without ever drawing a second glance. That night in late May 2003, he checked into a North Vancouver hotel, the kind of place used by travelers, couples, and occasionally, sex workers meeting clients in semi-private safety. Whether he knew Shelby was transgender before inviting her, there is a question that has never been fully answered. Some speculated that he found her through an escort listing or a street-based interaction. Others suggested that he may have known, or at least suspected, her gender identity before they arrived at the hotel. But what is clear is this: at some point during their time together, during or shortly after their first intimate interaction, Jatin discovered the truth. And his reaction was swift, violent, and fatal. This wasn't the response of a man caught off guard and walking away. This was the response of someone who believed they had been deceived, and that such a revelation gave him the right to become judge, jury, and executioner. Was it shame? Rage? Fragile masculinity pushed to the brink? Or was it something darker, a desire to punish, to erase what he couldn't understand or accept? No one can fully say what was in Jatin Patel's mind at that moment. But in the seconds that followed his discovery, his hands closed around Shelby's throat. He strangled her until she stopped breathing, her voice silenced not because she lied, but because she dared to live in her truth. He didn't run immediately. He stayed in the room with her body. The silence afterward must have been deafening. By the time he left, he had crossed a line from anonymity into infamy. May 27, 2003. It began like so many nights before it, a transaction, an agreement, a routine part of Shelby Tracy Tom's world. She met Jatin Patel, a man who seemed unremarkable at first glance. He was polite, composed, and gave no indication of what was to come. Together, they checked into a North Vancouver hotel, likely just another stop in a long string of anonymous encounters Shelby had navigated with resilience and caution. Inside the room, the world shrank. The bustling sounds of Davy Street faded behind thick walls and closed doors. It was just Shelby and Jatin. For a moment, she might have believed this would be like every other client, short, impersonal, done without incident. But what happened next shattered everything. As the two became intimate, something changed. Jatin discovered that Shelby was transgender. Whether during the act or in its immediate aftermath remains unclear. But the reaction was not confusion. It was not dialogue. It was not even rejection. It was rage. In an instant, whatever mask Jatin wore fell away. According to court records, his response was not hesitation or shock. It was violent and immediate. In what can only be described as a fit of blind fury, he lunged at Shelby and began to strangle her with his bare hands. Shelby, caught off guard, stood no chance against the sudden eruption of violence. No one heard her scream. No one came knocking. Inside that hotel room, in the cold and sterile quiet, Shelby's life was taken, not because she was dangerous, not because she had harmed anyone, but because she lived openly as a transgender woman. Her identity, her existence, became the justification in one man's mind for murder. When it was over, Shelby lay lifeless on the floor. Jatin didn't immediately flee. He remained in the room for a short time, perhaps stunned by what he had done, perhaps not. When he finally left, he left her there, discarded, erased, as if her life meant nothing. By morning, the hotel would become a crime scene. But for the hours that followed her death, Shelby's voice was gone, her truth silenced by the very hatred she had learned to live beside all her life. And the man who killed her vanished into the city, as if she had never existed at all. When the violence ended, Shelby Tracy Tom lay still. The room, just hours earlier a space of quiet negotiation, was now a silent grave. Jutin Patel stood over her body, not a killer in the legal sense just yet, but certainly one in fact. The weight of what he had done didn't seem to hit all at once. He didn't cry. He didn't call for help. He didn't even try to revive her. He simply began to process the one thing that mattered most to him now: getting away. In the aftermath of the killing, Jutin didn't linger long. But he didn't run immediately either. He left Shelby's body in the hotel room, perhaps believing the anonymity of the location would buy him time. He made sure to wipe down any surfaces he may have touched. He gathered his belongings, checked himself in the mirror, and walked out of that hotel as calmly as he had entered, blending once again into the background of the city. It was a cold, calculated retreat, one that revealed just how little remorse he felt in the moment. For Jutin, this wasn't just about fleeing a scene. It was about erasing a life, making it vanish like it never mattered. He discarded evidence, changed his clothes, and attempted to disappear into Vancouver's crowded streets. But his escape was not as clean as he had hoped. Hotel staff discovered Shelby's body shortly after he left. It didn't take long before the room was sealed off and declared a crime scene. Her body, once full of life and resistance, was now cataloged into evidence. And with it came the hunt for the man responsible. Surveillance footage from the hotel captured Jutin's image. Witnesses gave descriptions. Police were quick to act, because this wasn't just another murder. This was a hate-fueled killing, and the city, especially its LGBTQ+ community, was demanding answers. Just 2 days after the murder, on May 29, 2003, Jutin Patel was arrested. His attempt at vanishing had failed. The panic, the attempt to hide, the effort to detach himself from Shelby's death, it all unraveled almost as quickly as it began. Now caught in the hands of the law, Jutin's future would be defined by the life he had so brutally taken. May 29, 2003, just 2 days after Shelby Tracy Tom's murder, the search for her killer came to an abrupt end. The investigation had moved quickly, thanks in part to hotel surveillance footage, eyewitness accounts, and swift coordination between local authorities. The man in the video, the last person seen with Shelby alive, was identified as Jutin Patel. When police located and apprehended him, Patel didn't resist. He was calm, composed, and when confronted with the evidence, he confessed. In his own words, Jutin admitted to killing Shelby. He explained that during their sexual encounter, he discovered she was transgender. That single moment, when identity clashed with expectation, triggered what he described as uncontrollable rage. According to investigators, he believed he had been deceived, and in his mind, that deception justified murder. His confession was chilling not only for its bluntness, but for its lack of remorse. There was no attempt to deny, no alternative version of events, just a brutal matter-of-fact admission. He killed her because of who she was. But what followed was deeply unsettling. Despite the violent nature of the crime and the clear motive rooted in prejudice, Canadian law at the time did not officially classify Shelby's murder as a hate crime. There was no enhancement in Patel's charges for the fact that Shelby was a transgender woman. Instead, the media and parts of the public began to frame the crime through the lens of sexual deception, subtly shifting the blame onto Shelby for not disclosing her identity to Patel, a narrative dangerously common in cases involving transgender victims. Trans advocates and LGBTQ+ organizations were outraged. To them, this wasn't a crime of passion or misunderstanding. It was a hate crime, pure and simple. A woman was dead not because she posed a threat, but because of her gender identity. And the lack of legal recognition sent a chilling message that trans lives were still seen as disposable. In the eyes of the law, Shelby was a victim. But in the court of public opinion, her identity was put on trial. As Jutin awaited sentencing, the community rallied behind Shelby's memory, demanding justice not just for her, but for the many transgender women whose murders had been ignored, minimized, or blamed on the victims themselves. The trial of Judin Patel began in 2004, less than a year after the murder of Shelby Tracy Tom. On paper, it seemed straightforward. Patel confessed to the killing. There was no dispute over the facts, and he was clearly responsible. But as the court proceedings unfolded, it became clear this was more than just a murder case. It became a mirror, reflecting society's discomfort with gender identity and the systemic failure to protect the most vulnerable. Patel was not charged with first-degree murder. Instead, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter. The argument? That he had experienced what's disturbingly known in legal circles as trans panic, a defense claiming that discovering a partner is transgender can provoke such shock and distress that it diminishes responsibility. Though not officially codified in Canadian law, this concept lingered in the courtroom shadows. The judge accepted Patel's claim that he had not intended to kill Shelby before the encounter, and that his actions stemmed from a sudden and uncontrollable rage. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison, with time served and eligibility for early release. It was a penalty that many saw as insultingly light for the brutality of the crime. But perhaps more painful than the sentence was how Shelby was treated during the trial. Her identity, her right to exist, was called into question repeatedly. Some media outlets misgendered her, referring to her by her dead name or using male pronouns. Others subtly framed the story around the idea that Shelby had tricked Patel, as though her existence demanded justification. In court, her life was not painted with dignity. It was dissected through the lens of her work as a sex worker and her transgender identity. She was not just a victim. She was put on trial herself. To many in the LGBTQ+ community, justice had not been served. Shelby's killer had confessed, yes, but the court's leniency, the media's language, and the public silence told a darker story. That transgender lives, especially those living at the intersections of poverty and sex work, were still seen as less worthy of outrage, empathy, or justice. Her death became a case file. Her identity, a legal technicality, and the shadow of that verdict lingers still. Her name was Shelby Tracy Tom. She was a daughter, a friend, a fighter, and a woman who dared to live her truth in a world that so often punishes authenticity. She was more than the headlines that followed her death, more than the courtroom transcripts, more than the label of sex worker or transgender victim. Shelby was a human being who navigated the dangerous edge of society with courage, because to exist openly as a transgender woman, and especially as a sex worker, is to live with the constant threat of violence, rejection, and erasure. Her murder on May 27, 2003, was not just the end of a life, it was the continuation of a global pattern. Transgender women, particularly those involved in sex work, face disproportionate levels of violence, often with little to no legal recourse. Too often, the world remains silent. Too often, justice is partial, conditional, or delayed. And too often, the victims are blamed for their own deaths. But Shelby's name refused to be forgotten. In the years following her murder, her case became a reference point in conversations around trans rights, legal reform, and hate crime legislation in Canada. LGBTQ+ activists, human rights groups, and trans-led organizations cited her story when demanding better protections, respectful representation in media, and the abolishment of harmful narratives like the trans panic defense. Shelby's life and death became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the urgent need for change. Because every Shelby deserves to live without fear, to love, to work, to exist without apology. Her name matters. Her story matters. And remembering her isn't just an act of mourning, it's an act of resistance. The story of Shelby Tracy Tom is not just a case file. It is a mirror held up to our society's failures and a call to do better. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about acknowledgement, dignity, and change. If this story moved you, challenged you, or opened your eyes, we ask one thing. Subscribe to our channel. Share these stories. Help amplify the voices of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Because Shelby deserved better, and so do the countless others like her. Turn on notifications to never miss a story that matters.